Good evening and welcome to Clare College Digital Gala Week. My name is Katie Astley and I'm the Interim Deputy Development Director at Clare. We're so happy to be able to bring Clare to you, especially this summer when we can't welcome as many of you into the college for events, and of course travel to Cambridge is so difficult. So we're really delighted that you can join us this evening. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to outline a couple of items of housekeeping. Firstly, please be aware that this session is being recorded and the link to the talk will be available on our website from tomorrow morning. So please feel free to access that at your leisure and of course to share it with any friends and family that you think would be interested in hearing this talk. The structure of the evening session is that Helen will talk for 40 minutes and we will then have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. If I may ask you to please submit any questions that you have using the chat function during the talk at any time, I will then facilitate those questions and feed them through to Helen at the end. So it would be great to have a variety of questions, so please do feel free to submit those as Helen is speaking. It just remains for me to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Helen Thompson, Professor Helen Thompson, forgive me, Helen. Helen has been a Fellow of Clare since 1994, and she's also Professor of Political Economy in the university's Department of Politics and International Studies. Helen is a regular columnist for the new Statesman and a participant on the Talking Politics podcast alongside her academic work. Her next book is coming out early next year, published by Oxford University Press, and it will examine the historical origins of the geopolitical, economic and political disruption of this past decade, which is something I think we're all particularly attuned to at the moment and will be really interesting to learn more about. So on that note, Helen, I welcome you to this evening. Thank you for coming and please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Katie, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me hope that I can share this screen with you. Okay, so what I wanted to talk today about is energy politics and what I think about as a sort of a set of illusions that we have about energy politics and its relationship to climate, and the way in which what I think of as a disposition to think in binary terms gets in the way of understanding the immensity of the issues that we face around the energy revolution. Now I've hit the same problem I hit earlier with moving these screens. Sorry about this, I've just got to find a way of moving. There we go. It keeps getting jammed. So there's quite a lot of different ways in which it could approach this. But I want to start really with two simple binaries that I think are in play in the way in which energy issues and climate issues are talked about, and explain, focusing on the first of these, and why I think that they're misleading. The first and the most simple in a way is to think about the future that we face where energy is concerned in terms of fossil fuels versus renewables. Now, there is one area, as I'm going to explain in a moment, where this makes some sense, although even there some qualifications have to be put in place. But in other respects, I think that it really is misleading. And if you take this to an extreme form, I think that you get almost like a Manichaean projection onto the energy climate debate. We get the idea that what fossil fuels are essentially going to lead us to is the apocalypse, is that the destruction of the climate, in terms of at least the destruction of the ability of human beings to live with the climate on this earth, versus the idea of techno-salvation, an idea of technological progress that is going to save us from the Gotterdammerung that we're otherwise on the path to. And I don't think that this is a very helpful way of thinking about the difficulties that we face. On the one hand, it makes the stakes too high in terms of apocalypse, the end of the end of the human ability to live on Earth, versus the idea that we can create an entirely new society through transforming the energy basis of the present one. we're going to be much more, I think, dealing with, if you like, more gradual problems that are still going to be immensely difficult to deal with. So let's try and flesh out some of this. I want to start with the question of like fossil fuels versus renewables in a particular form, because one of the narratives that I think that has become quite common is to believe that we're living in a world in which fossil fuels are declining and that renewables are ascendant. And I don't think that this gets to even beginning to understand the complexity of what's going on in the energy world at the moment. And one of the things that is very striking about the way in which renewables are talked about is that quite often people who talk as if they know what they're talking about where energy and climate are concerned will give some percentage of the amount of what they say is energy that is coming from renewables, and what they actually mean is the proportion of electricity that is coming from renewables. So there's a need right from the beginning to distinguish from what's happening in terms of overall energy consumption and where the energy sources for what the energy sources for that are, and what's going on with electricity. And we can see this quite clearly in this chart that I've taken from almost all the charts I'm taking are from Our World in Data, which is a very useful site for climate and energy issues. And as you can see from here is that whilst it's the case that 1/3 of global electricity comes from low carbon sources, and that is including nuclear in this, a lot less of total energy does. When it comes to total energy, and then it is still oil that is the most important energy source. And I'm going to be coming back to oil at the end and the particular difficulties around oil production that exist at the moment. Now, if we start with then break this down and looking at electricity generation, there is definitely a positive story to tell. I've picked these countries and the world for reasons that I hope will become clear a little bit later. Is you can see there's a very positive story to tell about the share of electricity from low carbon sources in Germany, even in the United States, which during the Trump years was obviously had a president and indeed a Congress in the Senate anyway that didn't take climate change seriously. You can still see an increase in the share of electricity coming from low carbon sources. When we go though to the transport sector, which is by far the most difficult part of our world in which to try to move to try to decarbonize in, we can see something very different. This is the European Union countries, or Europe. It's actually the whole of Europe, not just the European Union. But the commitment or the plan, the target for the European Union is that 10% of energy and transport would come from renewable sources. You can see from this slide, 10% is the green straight line across the top, and you can see that there's been an increase, but we're really some way below 10% in Europe. There are individual European countries that are significantly higher in this, but if you look at it over now, what is a 15-year period over the course of this chart, we're talking about very modest progress. And that is in really sharp contrast to what's gone on, particularly in a significant number of European countries where electricity generation is concerned. The reason for this is, in one sense, is not complicated to explain. It's really at its heart, because changing, or put it differently, decarbonizing the transport sector either requires a new fuel, which would probably be hydrogen, or it requires large-scale electrification. It requires replacing what we presently do with primary energy and using and replacing that with electricity, and then using some energy sources to generate that electricity. And it's only where trains are concerned that both the technology and the infrastructure are in place to bring that change about. So it actually isn't that difficult to decarbonize the trains, if working from the assumption that you're using decarbonized electricity. This, though, is, if we move to electricity itself, it isn't entirely a straightforward question either, and that is because it really depends on what country that you are in. Clearly, we can see that technologies exist at scale to decarbonize electricity. The question is whether it can realistically be done without nuclear power, especially in places where the sun and wind are intermittent. So if you look at what can be done, for instance, in Scotland, if we just take two countries that are relatively geographically close to each other, if you look at what can be done in Scotland and compare it with what can be done in Germany, where wind is concerned, you get to very different conclusions. Germany has not in a good position where offshore wind is concerned. Scotland, by contrast, is in a very good position where offshore wind is concerned. And there was a very revealing speech that Angela Merkel made at the beginning of 2020 at the Davos meeting, and when she set this problem out in really, I think, as in some senses blunter terms as you could find from a politician of a governing party in a Western democracy, certainly. So this is what she said. She said, "We have set ourselves a target here in Germany of generating 65% or around 2/3 with renewable energies by 2030. That's quite a lot for a country where the sun doesn't shine all that often and where the wind blows quite irregularly. This involves setting up a completely new power line network, as the sources of energy production are, of course, mostly located far from where the energy is consumed. It's unlikely that it will be possible to achieve 100% share of renewable energies in electricity generation, because our energy capacity, i.e. the efficiency with which we can generate electricity from the wind and sun, isn't very high. There are regions in the world where this works much better." Now, one of the things that's always been part, I think, of the desire in Europe to move away from fossil fuels is the belief that in the era of oil in particular, but later gas, that energy has been a real problem in terms of creating foreign dependency for European countries because of the geographical distribution of oil and gas. But this idea that geography in some sense goes away when we move into renewables, that renewables become about technology, that fossil fuels are about geography, really runs into a difficulty when you face up to how difficult it is in some countries to get, as Angela Merkel saying here, is to get so much energy, that much energy efficiency out of sun and wind. Now, as I said, there is a positive story to be told about decarbonising the electricity sector, and you can even then turn it into a reasonably positive story about the overall primary energy that's coming from low carbon sources. Though note that when our World in Data present this, they always present this in terms of including nuclear as low carbon, whereas we know in Germany then the plan is for nuclear not to be part of the future. You can see here as well that if you just look at the last few years of what's happened in Germany and the United States, you can see quite a lot of progress in Germany and much less progress, indeed, the slip backwards in Germany. Sorry, in the United States. That's around the first year or so of the Trump presidency. But again, we can't get into the idea that we can move from positive story about renewables into straightforward positive story about reducing climate emissions. So if we take these next chart from our World in Data, and you just look at the last look at the last part of it, so what's gone on in around 2018-19, you can see that actually there's a bit of a sharper decline in carbon emissions in the US than there is in Germany. And this is despite the fact that Germany is doing a lot better in shifting into renewable energy than the United States during the same period. The reason for this is that all fossil fuels, when it comes to carbon emissions, are not the same. So if you look at these two charts, so the grey in both cases is coal, and the sort of deep orange colour is gas. What you can see is that in the United States case, coal has been coming down actually quite sharply, and indeed for longer than in the United States in terms of generating electricity. But the share of gas that gas does is much greater in the United States than it is in Germany. So because Germany's continued to use coal for as long as it has, and hasn't been able to switch as much between coal and gas as was possible for the Americans to do as a consequence of the gas shale boom, you actually have had a bigger reduction in emissions over the last few years, carbon emissions over the last few years in the United States than in Germany. The plan in Germany now is to be rid of coal by 2038, but that plan to be rid of coal by then also included a plan to build a new power station, a new coal-fired power station as part of the compromise that was reached. So even that isn't actually so straightforward. The next reason I think why we need to get away from the idea that we can think of the world in terms of renewables versus fossil fuels is that renewables require fossil fuel inputs at the moment, and in particular because solar panels and wind turbines are made from steel. Steel depends on high density energy from fossil fuels, principally coal. Indeed, steel is responsible for a not insignificant amount of carbon emissions. And when we look at this in terms of geopolitics and the geopolitical changes in the world economy over the last couple of decades, what we can see is that a great deal of steel production, and now around nearly half of the world's steel production now happens in China. So some of the positive stories that can be told about individual European countries in particular in terms of their reduction in carbon emissions over the last decade are in significant part the corollary of the fact that emissions in China have been on the trajectory that they have since China's entry into the World Trade Organization and spectacular economic growth in the first decade of the 21st century. So if you look at Britain, you can see that Britain is a case, the United Kingdom, I should say, is a case where the amount of coal that's being used in the overall is actually now very low. It's not. It's sort of in the level around renewables. Indeed, some of the renewables are higher than coal. But it's also the case, as we know, that the United Kingdom doesn't have much of a steel industry any longer. So when we look at China's energy consumption, we can see that coal is still, even though it's on a downward trajectory, is still not just under 60%, so well over 50% still of energy consumption in primary energy consumption is coming from coal. And effectively some part of that supports, I mean, I'm using the UK as an example here because our coal consumption is so low, but it could use any other number of Western countries. That China's coal consumption, which has been the most significant contributor to carbon emissions over the last 2 decades, supports effectively things that other non-China countries have done to move towards renewables, because right now it is not possible to manufacture solar panels and wind panels, solar panels and wind turbines without using fossil fuels. Now, another way of sort of telling the same story is to say that the reason why we are in the situation in which we are, in which it's proving extremely difficult to move rapidly with the energy revolution that is necessary in order to deal with the climate crisis, is because overall energy consumption is going up. And that is true in relation to all the different ways in which all the different energy sources that there are. So whilst we hear quite frequently about what an expansion that there has been in renewables, sorry, knocked on the slide too early, we can also see that there's been a pretty steady expansion in the use of the fossil fuel energy sources as well. And if we just take oil, because as I've said, I want to come back to that at the end, what we can see is these dips in oil consumption actually go hand in hand with either energy crises like in the 1970s or the economic crash of 2007, 2008, and reduced economic activity. So at the moment, we still live in a world in which essentially we can understand how far economies are growing by how much oil they consume. And that is being able to break that link, if it is possible indeed to break that link, is in one sense the big question that the future will be asking of us where energy is concerned. And it needs to be thought of as something, at the world aggregate level, rather than being able to say that individual Western countries have been able to reduce their oil consumption. And if we look at this in terms of which has been the fastest growing energy source, the last year that there's data for this is 2019, so the year before the pandemic, which was actually a year that was quite where growth was quite stagnant. You can see from this that the fossil fuel, the energy source that was grew the most that year in terms of overall world consumption was gas by some distance, and oil consumption was still growing more than wind and solar. So the world that we live in at the moment, where energy is concerned, is one where we're adding renewable energy to fossil fuels, particularly to oil and gas. Coal generally is on a bit more of a decline. It is not a world in which renewables are replacing fossil fuel energy. It's a world in which energy consumption is still rising really rather rapidly. As you can see, though, this is a very long-term chart going back to 1800, but you can see how sharp the rise still is in overall energy consumption across the world. And what we are doing collectively is meeting that demand by adding renewables to the fossil fuel mix. We're not doing a replacement of it. There is, as I suggested earlier, or said earlier, there is some replacement in the electricity sector, but when you look at the global aggregate picture, it's addition. It's not replacement. Now, I want to finish then by saying something about oil itself. And oil, as we know, is basically, in our present way of life, not just in the West, but certainly in the West, hardwired into our daily existence. And the reasons for that are, well, they are many, and at the center of it is the issue of transportation, where oil is the energy source that dominates. And you can see from this chart that there is a reasonably linear line in terms of the growth of world oil consumption during the course of this century, with the dip that's taking place in the period around the 2007-2008 financial crash. And if we look at then the world as it was then and compare it to the world as it was just before the pandemic, then there was getting on for an extra, well, nearly an extra 20 million barrels of oil, 20 million barrels of oil a day being consumed. Now, it is also the case that about the time, around 2005, that production of what's called conventional oil, that is essentially oil that is produced by conventional means that excludes shale oil, largely produced in the United States, and tar sands, largely but not entirely produced in Canada, that the production of conventional oil stagnated around 2005. There was a little bit of a recovery in 2016, well, perhaps 2015, 2016. But essentially, in the years after the crash of 2007, 2008, then the amount of oil that the world wanted to consume was dependent upon the production of shale oil, in particular from the United States. And you can see, if you go back to this period in the years between 2005 and the beginnings of the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, that this was a period of exceptionally high oil prices. Prices actually peaked in the summer of 2008, 3 months before the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, at around $150 a barrel. And the cause of that driver is essentially, if you look at the year like 2007, you can see the difference between the amount of oil that was being consumed that year and the amount of oil that was being produced. There was a much significantly greater demand for oil than there was oil being produced, and that's the explanation as to why prices accelerated as much as they did in 2007 and carried on into 2008. The reason why 2008 isn't such a sharp year is because in the middle of that year, once they peaked around the $150 a barrel price, then they crashed. They crashed very rapidly. But if you then go back and look at if you move forward and then look at the years after the last decade, essentially the years after the crash and the last decade, you can see that the issue reappears again in 2013, another period in which oil prices were high. Indeed, they've been high for the previous couple of years. But right at the end in 2019, you can see that we have another moment where the amount of oil that was being consumed was significantly higher than the amount of oil that was being produced, despite the fact that the shale oil boom was still going considerably at that point. That hasn't really been the case since, because the pandemic proved to be a major blow to the American shale oil industry. So what we can see, I think, is that there is a growing structural problem that was basically taken care of by shale for a decade or so, around the supply of oil in relation to the demand for oil. And another way of seeing evidence of this is what has happened since the pandemic. You can see the beginning of the grey shade of area is that the pandemic brought about a big crash in the price of oil. Indeed, in the futures market, the price of oil went negative at one point. But as you can see, that it's already recovered to around 75 dollars a barrel, despite the fact, as we know, that we're some distance away from anything like a full economic recovery. So even though we are living in a world in which mobility is being very significantly reduced beyond, I would say, most people's imagination when the pandemic started, we are still beginning to see we are still seeing the beginnings of some oil problems. Again, now there's various ways we might think about this in terms of it being inflationary, but it also, I think, has significant consequences for the ways we can think about energy. And it's this note that I want to really to bring things to a close, and to say something about the way in which I think we have to get used to understanding that we have two simultaneous problems where energy is concerned. We have the problem of cheap resource depletion, so that the problem we had in the immediate years leading up to 2008 was that oil became incredibly expensive. And in order to deal with that, then we had to move, or the world had to effectively create, or conditions emerged, shall we say, let's put it that way. Conditions emerged that made it possible to extract shale oil that had previously been too expensive to extract. And the reason why it became possible to do that was because of the monetary and financial conditions that followed from the 2007-2008 crash, quantitative easing and zero interest rates. And that made it possible for what would otherwise be prohibitively expensive oil to be extracted. And we're now in a situation where, in order to meet demand, that shale oil is still necessary, but the financial circumstances around it and some of the production circumstances around it have become more difficult. At the same time, we are very clearly facing not just climate change problems in the future, but climate change problems now, as can be seen from what's happening in the northwest of the United States and Canada this week, in terms of the temperatures that have prevailed there. But what I want to suggest is that neither of these problems can be dealt with by pretending that the other one doesn't exist, because we simultaneously need to find a way of dealing with providing or ensuring that there is sufficient oil supply in relation to demand as it presently is, at reasonable costs, and at the same time working out how we're going to leave oil as much as possible behind. So we need simultaneously a strategy for getting away from oil, at the same time as a strategy for how we're going to manage dealing with oil for the next 10, 20, maybe even 30 years, conceivably actually even longer. And I think that the worrying thing at the moment is that when people try to think about both of the problems at the same time, then some cognitive dissonance ensues. And you can see that in the various reports and comments that have come out of the International Energy Agency over the last 6 months or so. On the one hand, the International Energy Agency, which usually until this year writes reports that essentially had been saying that there's an oil problem coming up around the 2040s, when shale basically is on a serious shale oil is on a serious decline, wrote a report this year which essentially said that we need to get out of oil as soon as possible, and there shouldn't be really any further investment in the oil industry. And yet, at the same time, in the last few weeks, the International Energy Agency has been making comments essentially about the problem of low investment in the oil industry, and the fact that without further investment in the oil industry, there's going to be an oil supply problem, at least in relation to prices. And I think that the difficulty of the reason why this cognitive dissonance arises is because when it comes to energy, it seems that we all find it quite difficult to think about multiple problems that pull in opposite directions at the same time. But that is actually the problem that we face, is that we have to deal with simultaneous deep problems that raise some fairly fundamental questions about our way of life, particularly in the West. And we have to find some ways of grappling with them that don't lead us to deny one problem and essentially think that only one of them exists. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand back to Katie. Sorry, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen, very much for walking us through such a complex subject so clearly, and for those really helpful visuals as well. If I encourage the audience to submit any questions for Helen, I have a couple myself just to get us started, if that's okay, Helen.
Yeah, sure.
It really struck me what you said about the cognitive dissonance element at the end, and which led right back to the beginning about the sort of apocalypse versus successful Renaissance kind of narrative. One thing I've really picked up in the media is the problem that this level of apocalyptic sort of vision actually can be very counterproductive in terms of public engagement, because of the sort of fact that people just think, oh my gosh, this is just so awful and overwhelming, I just can't bear to think about it. Do you have any thoughts about that problem of engagement and how we might be able to address that in a more positive way?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the problems is that what's the way of putting this? I think that there's a tendency in Western thinking over long periods of time to construct things around this binary of apocalypse versus progress, or apocalypse versus utopia. And so the only thing that we can imagine is either the world coming to an end or the world being made much, much better. And I think that the problem with the climate change issue, and I think here it is, the climate change is the point of entry, is that it's very open to both of those ideas. So it's very easy for people to understand that fossil fuels have set us on such a destructive path, we might be making the planet inhabitable for human beings. And obviously then you have certain activist groups like Extinction Rebellion that take that quite literally and say, you know, the stakes here are the extinction of the human species. And on the other side of it, you have coming out of a tradition, I would say, of like techno-optimism generally, the people who think that, no, actually, if we pull off this energy revolution, then we can not just save the planet or save us in relation to the humankind in relation to the planet, we can actually make the planet we can make human life, collective human life on the planet, a much better place at the same time. And you can see that again also in the same people who sort of use the language of Extinction Rebellion will also talk about climate justice, as if somehow that saving the world from extinction is going to eliminate all the things that human beings do that are bad to each other, like at the same time that we're going to have a humanity, like reset. And I think that both, I just think that this is really hopeless way of trying to like think about like what are these problems of the kind that I've been discussing. And I think the danger, the difficulty that the climate issue in particular poses is that it just so lends itself to separating out into these two scenarios, like of apocalypse versus progress. And it's because they're such imaginatively alluring ideas to many people, perversely, where the apocalypse is concerned. But I think there is a kind of attraction in some sense to that idea that we're not very good, either us as citizens or the politicians, in thinking about how can we actually deal in practical terms with the complex set of the problems that are in front of us. And I think that the danger of both of them, in a way, of the narratives, is that they're both different versions of a certain kind of fatalism, like fatalism that it's too late to do anything, which I absolutely would reject. But fatalism, on the other sense, an optimistic fatalism that, okay, technology is such that it will prevail because that's the trajectory that human beings are on, to ever more technological development, and this is the next frontier, if you like, that's got to be overcome. And I think it's quite striking, and I've noted this when I've written things about one particular piece that I wrote about energy, about climate and energy. And generally, I think that people find it a lot easier to engage with what I say about climate than what I say about oil. That actually the sort of the problem of resource depletion, or it's at least cheap resource depletion, which is much less susceptible to these narratives, actually is harder, I think, for most people to engage with than the one that lends itself to the moral narratives around apocalypse and progress.
I wonder as well if some of that is linked, again, you alluded to the sort of massive complexity of these issues, and particularly the latter, like you say, it's quite difficult to explain and for people to grasp. And I wonder, has any of the work that you've done led to engagement with campaigning groups or governments in terms of better communication, in terms of some of these very complicated problems and interaction between difficult, complicated problems?
Yeah, I haven't done. I mean, I have had various like conversations with some politicians and with some people. One person in particular at the World Economic Forum on the oil side of things, which is where I came at this from in the first place, because of the fact, which I talked about obviously a lot less today, is because the oil problem has such destabilizing macroeconomic consequences as well as these other issues, and the geopolitics of it is obviously always has been, like pretty fraught. I think though that the difficulty that is there in terms of communication is that for the politicians is that they still very much want to be able to tell, for some very understandable reasons, a very positive story about what they would refer to call the green energy transition, rather than what I think it really is which would be a green energy revolution. Though I noticed that Boris Johnson's seems a bit keener now on talking about a green industrial revolution. But again, I think that's still trying to like a bit minimize what's going on. So I think for the politicians at the moment, not just in this country, but in lots of places, is that the attractions of dealing with climate change is that it looks like it can also be an economic strategy. It looks like it can be a strategy for creating new jobs. it's a story about making things economically better. It can be a story about like restoring manufacturing sectors. In Boris Johnson's version of it, it's part of the levelling up strategy. I think it's actually part of the way in which he thinks he can preserve the union, like by sort of by the encouragement of an offshore wind industry in Scotland, creating new jobs there, making sure it looks like it's got UK sort of banner on it, so to speak. And all those things are well and good. I'm not trying to not that, because it's quite clearly the case that that new jobs can be created from addressing climate change, but that doesn't address climate change, and it doesn't address the energy problem in itself. And so that's what the worry is about it, is that it's too easy for politicians to use the positive story that they can tell about economic growth and jobs, and that takes away both from citizens understanding how difficult this energy revolution is and what it actually entails, and also that it doesn't make it easy when it also involves sacrifices, when it also involves things that go into cost. I mean, for instance, like switching everybody, replacing everybody's boilers, whether that's be moving to hydrogen boilers ultimately or heat pumps. That isn't something that is going to come without costs to individuals. In the same way, it really is very much open to question, I think, whether you can move to an electric vehicle revolution and you're still going to have mass car ownership. Indeed, the House of Commons climate change report a couple of years ago basically said that electric vehicles come with minority car ownership, and you have to have a much more developed public transport system that goes with it. And my worry is that these are not the kind of harder choices that the politicians want to talk about when they present, when they engage with climate, because they come at it. And I think that is a reason why they've become so much more serious about it over the last couple of years, is because they've looked at it in terms of an economic growth strategy more than they've looked at it in terms of how do we deal with these really complex energy questions.
That leads actually very neatly into a question that's come in from Margaret, which is a comment on that slide about the consumption slide, where you saw that rapid increase and the continued increase. It's really powerful, and I think quite surprising to see that even now, given what you were just saying about the sort of issue around economic growth and the sort of strategies that governments are employing. Do you think that concept of continual economic progress is compatible with the goal of reducing consumption or rebalancing consumption, or at some point ultimately does that tension become impossible to resolve?
I mean, yeah, I'm skeptical about how far in the end that it's possible to decouple economic life from energy consumption. I mean, at the moment, where oil is concerned, probably the correlation is above the 90s, or around the 90% level. So I think the idea it can be broken entirely, it just doesn't make sense, because in some sense, all economic activity is the application of energy. Obviously, what that energy form is another matter. I think that I start from the position that the idea of like infinite growth on a finite planet was always a problematic one. And I think that, again, I don't want to go down the road of like sort of suggesting too much of a binary way of thinking about this, because that's what I'm trying to get away from here. And there's obviously room for plenty of debate about how far that you can go with lots of growth on a finite planet, like where the limits actually cut in. But I think that once you recognize that at the moment, as I've said, that like renewable energy depends on fossil fuel inputs, it also, which is I didn't talk about, but could have talked about, depends on lots of, like rare earths, metals. The idea that we can just move towards endless economic growth, but substitute over however long period it's going to take us renewables for fossil fuels, and growth comes back. I am in the end skeptical about that assumption. I think that there isn't really any way there isn't any realistic future that doesn't involve some quite serious changes to everybody's ways of life. Now, that doesn't mean that has to be a much worse world. I don't mean that, and they might not in the end be huge sacrifices. But I think that in the end, as I say, the big question is how long is in the end, but that we have to recognize some limits to growth. And I say that well aware of the fact that many projections about limits to growth, not least a famous report in the 1970s, have turned out thus far in their predictions to be wrong. And that's where I think the difficulty is because you can say that any set of predictions, it's very difficult to make these predictions. People who make them get them wrong because there are so many variables involved, and it may be that the limits are very far in the future. But in the end, I believe the limits exist.
Thank you. And just one last question, if I may, which is actually about, for those of us who want to work within or support the environment and climate change, do you think it's possible to do that when one is working within a traditional company, or do you think the only way to engage is if you're essentially doing advocacy from think tanks, from sort of governmental organizations? I mean, there's been a lot in the news recently about the sort of the big traditional companies, and that, again, the narrative has been quite simplistic in terms of, good or bad. Is there a way in which people can actually engage positively with those from within? Or
no, I think so. I mean, I think that I think there is something in that, where energy is concerned, in that Gandhian, like nostrum, about being the change that you want to see. And I think that the idea, well, I'll put this differently. I think one of the problems of the difficult consequences of the technological fix narrative is precisely that it actually leads people not to take responsibility and not to think that they can make a difference in the things that they do, whether in their individual lives, in their houses, in their work places, because there's just some technology that's going to come and solve the energy problem and take care of it all. And I don't think that that's the case. And I think that it will come from us all having a much greater change. Has to come from us all having a much greater awareness of what the attempted energy revolution entails, and doing whatever things that are available to us to do. And that may well actually include, in the end, I think it will in the end, like reducing our personal energy consumption, or reducing the energy consumption of the places in which we work. And I think it's one of those strange things about modern life in that sense is that modern life has rested on the application of fossil fuel energy to our entire, like daily existence. And yet it's something that most of us spend very, very little time thinking about, or even aware of, and the ways in which we use energy, the ways in which we waste energy. And I think that the more that in our daily lives we are engaged with the issue of energy consumption and how it has to change, then the easier it will be for us to navigate a way through these difficulties.
I think that's a hopeful note to end on, in that I do feel that there is a sense that people are becoming gradually more aware and more engaged. So should we stop there?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to
On
stop.
a reasonably hopeful note.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for
It's a pleasure.
sharing and for putting so much thought into both the talk and also the answers to those questions. Really, really appreciated. And thank you for giving up your time this evening.
It's a pleasure, Katie.
Thank you. And similarly to the audience, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we look forward to welcoming you back to Clare soon. Thank you.
Bye.